Last September, EPA finalized its national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants for brick and structural clay product manufacturing, commonly called BRIC-MACT. This rule contains ultra-stringent new emission targets, and in fact, it used as a baseline EPA's 2003 BRIC-MACT rule, which already reduced industry emissions by 95%, according to a recent report. It should be noted that those 2003 BRIC-MACT standards were vacated by a federal court in 2007. But as in so many EPA regulations where suits are filed and the complainants win, the money is already spent. The effort to comply has already been taken, and so it's too late for a practical relief for these people. And that's precisely where the brick industry is finding itself today. So I look forward to additional discussion. We have two panels of witnesses today about these practical common sense bills, and hopefully we can provide some relief to these industries as they try to protect jobs, help economic growth, and to expand their industries. With that, at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman, and I thank the witness, colleague. Today's hearing focuses on a couple of bills, the BRIC Act and the Sense Act, that are a familiar effort to weaken the Clean Air Act. Mr. Chairman, well-thought-out regulations make businesses more competitive and protect American people. These bills echo what we saw, for example, with the Ratepayer Protection Act, a partisan effort to weaken the Clean Air Act. Addressing air quality is a health and economic issue. Poor air quality can disrupt businesses, individuals, and families who have to live with its consequences. It's irresponsible and morally bankrupt to needlessly delay a rule from taking effect that will improve air quality, especially if the intent is to delay it indefinitely. The bills under consideration simply seek to maintain the status quo. Well, the status quo isn't good enough. Our country can do better than that. I represent part of the San Joaquin Valley, which is also called the famed Central Valley of California, but unfortunately it has some of the worst air quality in the nation. Employees miss work, children miss school days, and the elderly are often encouraged to stay inside on certain days. We've seen the air quality improve over the last decade, which I'm happy to say I've experienced, but we are still living in poor air. I've seen firsthand the effect of the pollution on our communities. Valley air quality is affected from a variety of sources, from China, from in-state and out-of-state vehicles, from drought, as well as from pollutions drifting in from other parts of the state and from other states. That's not to mention unforeseen incidents like the methane leak that's been releasing millions of pounds of methane per day in Southern California. Our region has worked hard and taken steps to help address one of the biggest issues facing the valley. Recent improvements have produced significant economic and health benefits, but there's still an enormous amount of work to be done. Having worked in the private sector in an emerging field, I understand the difficulties that come with raising capital and business targets that are always moving around. But these advancements take time and investments. Sticking with the status quo is not and will never be the solution. Fossil fuels will remain an important bridge of energy source as our country moves forward to cleaner energy sources. But as we move forward, we should maintain focus on making carbon energy production as clean as possible through technology and effective use of regulation. The EPA has used the Clean Air Act to improve the lives of millions of Americans and reduce harmful emissions. The Clean Air Act has worked, and we should continue building on this landmark legislation, not slowly dismantle it. And by the way, did I suggest that my colleagues embrace carbon sequestration? With that, I'd like to recognize my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
I want to thank my friend for yielding time. I also want to thank Congressman Rothfus from my home state for appearing before our committee today and for his work on this important issue. I've seen these coal refuge piles firsthand, and I've witnessed significant benefit processing waste coal that can provide to these sites. Our state, Pennsylvania, is home to nearly 3/4 of the active coal refuge power plants in the country. There are more than 5,000 coal refuge sites that cover approximately 184,000 acres throughout our state and pose a significant threat to local habitats and communities. As many of you on this committee know, I'm an all of the above guy when it comes to our energy portfolio, and coal refuge power plants provide an additional benefit in that they improve the local environment. I think they're an important part of Pennsylvania's power system and help ensure we're good stewards of our land and water. This bill would certainly help ensure their continued use in years to come. I'd note to my colleagues that this bill is also significantly improved from previous versions. Cleaning up these waste coal piles is a major priority for our state, and we need to figure this difficult problem out. However, I also want to ensure that we're protecting our air, not playing favorites when it comes to picking power sources and preserving important regulations in the regulatory process. I still have some remaining concerns on aspects of these bills, but I want to thank Congressman Rothfus for highlighting the importance of this pressing issue for Pennsylvania that's before our committee today, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, Mr. Upton's not here, so I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, the author of the BRIC Act, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing today to examine both the legislation that my colleague, Mr. Rothfus, has introduced, and the BRIC Act, a discussion draft that addresses the EPA's national emission standards for the brick and structural clay products manufacturing industry, which was finalized last September 24th of 2015. Simply put, the BRIC Act would allow for the consideration and completion of any judicial review regarding the EPA's emission standards for the brick industry before requiring compliance. Mr. Chairman, I want to take just a moment to illustrate how the EPA's new regulation will affect the industry and why the BRIC Act is so desperately needed. The majority of U.S. brick plants are small family-owned operations. They're often located in small communities that depend on the plant for good-paying jobs. Whitaker Greer Brick, located in Alliance, Ohio, is just such a company that fits that description. Whitaker Greer employs 75 people, offers education and training benefits, and health insurance to its employees. To comply with the EPA's requirements, Whitaker Greer will be forced to borrow millions of dollars to pay for the required control equipment. Many brick companies are already struggling to find the capital for plant modernization projects. I can't imagine how difficult it will be for these companies like Whitaker Greer to secure the needed investments to pay for new control equipment that provides zero return on investment. Additionally, and this is an important point, the EPA, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, finalized a similar rule in 2003 that already required brick companies to spend millions of dollars on control equipment. And the industry did that when that rule was implemented. A few years later, a federal court vacated that rule, making that investment useless. Unfortunately, the brick industry couldn't roll back the clock and recover the investment they had made. And worse yet, the EPA's new emission rules use reductions achieved by the vacated rule as the baseline for further emission reduction requirements. Now, I don't think anybody here would disagree. I see the need to protect public health and the environment. But it is unfair that the agency's new rule does not give the industry credit for the emission reductions that it has already achieved. This lack of consideration, in addition to other EPA rule requirements, places the industry's very survival in jeopardy. The brick industry is a part of the American fabric. It's a part of American culture. It has built some of the most iconic buildings and towns in existence today. We must make certain our regulations and laws preserve this industry not end it. The BRIC Act will help keep this important industry alive. Unless we want to start constructing buildings out of sticks and straw, we better wise up. We collectively, all across this country, here in the House, in the Senate, in the federal agencies like the EPA, need to act responsibly on this issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I look
Would the
forward
gentleman
to
yield?
discussing the issue.
Would the gentleman yield?
requirements.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I certainly will yield.
Thank you. I just want to take this time to welcome Congressman Rothfus from Pennsylvania, and especially on this piece of legislation. Congressman Doyle mentioned it. I also have a lot of sites that could be recycled. I think Keith proves to be a sound political mind and does due diligence, and we're glad you finally get a chance to air this bill before the subcommittee, and we want to welcome you. Likewise to my colleague and friend Bill Johnson, he's right. The brick industry is really mom and pop businesses that have operated and survived for many years. I would just remind my friends that the biggest damage to the health of our individual citizens is unemployment and no jobs. And so our fight is to make sure that we can continue to provide good paying jobs with health care benefits to our citizens before it's too late. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are considering two bills that undermine EPA air rules, rules that are instrumental in protecting public health and the environment by reducing mercury and other hazardous air pollutants from power plants and other industrial sources. Let me start with H.R. 3797, the Satisfying Energy Needs and Saving the Environment Act, or SENSE Act. This bill would revise the Mercury and Air Toxics, or MATS rule, and the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CASPR rule, to allow power plants that burn coal refuse to emit higher levels of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen chloride. Sulfur dioxide is known to cause adverse respiratory impacts, and hydrogen chloride is corrosive to eyes and skin and can irritate the respiratory tract. Supporters of this bill will say that facilities that burn coal refuse are doing a good thing by cleaning up the environment and generating power. But I don't think we're here today to debate that. Instead, we're here to consider whether facilities that burn coal refuse should be given a free pass on complying with EPA rules to reduce certain air pollutants. And I believe that's a very bad idea. Coal refuse plants are no different than other coal plants and therefore should be held to the same emission standards. Supporters of this bill have also argued that coal refuse plants deserve special treatment when it comes to these air rules. In the context of the MATS rule, I would note that the EPA, the courts, and the Senate, which considered a coal refuse-related amendment last January, have all reviewed and rejected the argument that they should be given special consideration. In the context of the CASPR rule, the SENSE Act is unnecessary and I just think bad policy. The current rule uses a phased-in approach to achieve emission reductions, where facilities receive emission allowances that decrease over time. The bill would shift a greater percentage of these emission allowances to coal refuse plants. EPA has a plan for how these allowances should be allocated to individual plants, but states also have the ability to submit their own plan for achieving the required emission reductions. What this means is the state, if it chooses, already has the power to give extra allowances to coal refuse plants, as this bill would mandate. Beyond being unnecessary, this provision undermines the CASPR trading system and creates inequities in the market. The SENSE Act picks winners and losers, tipping the scales in favor of coal refuse plants at the expense of all other plants within a state. Now, briefly turning to the other bill, the BRIC Act extends compliance deadlines until all legal challenges are resolved by the courts. If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. We saw a similar provision in H.R. 2042, the Ratepayer Protection Act. We also had a similar discussion at our hearing on that bill when a witness pointed out that the current judicial process for delaying a rule has, and I quote, withstood the test of time and ensures the courts will undertake a careful balancing of interests before granting a stay of agency action. And she further explained that the blanket extension in the discussion draft would, quote, create powerful incentives for frivolous litigation in an effort to stall and avoid compliance. I do understand there are special circumstances related to this particular rule. The brick industry has made good faith efforts to work with EPA and to reduce their emissions. However, the litigation delay in the BRIC Act creates a very bad precedent, in my opinion. The bills we are considering today would undermine protections and set bad legislative precedents going forward, and therefore I cannot support either of them. and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back, and that concludes the opening statements. Like our friend from Illinois, I also want to welcome Keith Rothfus, the member of Congress from the state of Pennsylvania, with us today. He's the author of the Sense Act and has been, I know we've had many discussions about it. I know he's been talking to EPA about it and had discussions with other groups as well. So welcome, Congressman Rothfus, and you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And be sure to turn the microphone on.
Are we on there? Does that work? Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today on two vitally important pieces of legislation, the Sense Act and the BRIC Act. I also want to thank Vincent Brazzini, Director of Environmental Affairs at Olympus Power, and Dennis Beck, the Chairman of the Western Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, for coming to Washington today to provide additional insight on my legislation. The Sense Act, which stands for Satisfying Energy Needs and Saving the Environment Act, is a common-sense solution that allows innovative coal refuse to energy facilities to generate affordable, reliable energy and continue their essential environmental remediation work in a responsible manner. As many of you know, the coal industry has been a central part of Pennsylvania's economy for many years. Unfortunately, historic mining activity littered Pennsylvania and a few other states with large piles of coal refuse, sometimes called waste coal, which is essentially a mix of lower quality coal, rocks, and dirt that remain after the mining and processing of coal. Before technology was invented to make use of this material, it accumulated in open spaces alongside cities and towns close to schools and neighborhoods and in fields across coal country. This led to a number of environmental problems that still plague affected communities. These include air pollution, damage to vegetation and wildlife, and water pollution from acid mine drainage. I have been to several of these sites and seen firsthand the environmental danger they pose. Coal refuse piles can catch fire and burn for unacceptably long periods of time, polluting nearby neighborhoods. Runoff from these sites can turn rivers orange and leave them devoid of life. According to Pennsylvania's environmental regulator, it would cost roughly $2 billion to clean up this hazard in my state alone. This is a significant challenge, but is one that Pennsylvanians and others in coal country are prepared to meet. The coal refuse to energy industry has been a leader in solving this problem. With advanced technology, this industry has been able to use this previously worthless material to generate affordable and reliable energy. In the process, they have removed over 200 million tons of coal refuse in Pennsylvania alone and remediated many formerly polluted sites. Thanks to the hard work of the dedicated people in this industry, landscapes have been restored, rivers and streams have been brought back to life, and towns across coal country have been relieved of unsafe and unsightly waste coal piles. And it is important to note that private sector leadership on this issue has saved taxpayers millions of dollars in cleanup costs. It has also created hundreds of family-sustaining jobs in areas that have been economically distressed for many years. These jobs and the communities they support are at risk today, unless we stand to defend them. The work that the coal refuse to energy industry has done is remarkable, and it represents an environmental success story that should transcend partisan lines. Despite my best efforts to advocate for a compromise, the Environmental Protection Agency has refused to adjust the regulations that threaten to shut down much of the coal refuse to energy industry, and thus imperil its vital remediation efforts. The intensification of two existing rules, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, or MATS rule, and the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CSPAR, is especially concerning. Though all coal refuse-fired power generators can meet the Mercury standard under MATS, let me reemphasize that. The coal refuse-fired power generators can meet the Mercury standards under MATS. Many facilities will be unable to meet the rule's new hydrogen chloride or sulfur dioxide standards. The Sense Act provides operators with alternative compliance standards that are strict but achievable. Similarly, although coal refuse-fired power generators were provided sufficient sulfur dioxide allocations in Phase 1 of the CSPAR's implementation, these facilities were allocated insufficient credits in Phase 2, which is set to begin in 2017. The Sense Act seeks to provide coal refuse-fired power plants with the same allocation levels in Phase 2 as in Phase 1. My bill also contains provisions to ensure that this change does not simply create a profit center for the industry. Credits allocated as a result of the Sense Act's implementation must go to covered plants, specifically those that use bituminous coal refuse, and they cannot be sold off to other operators. The Sense Act represents a common-sense compromise between the legitimate goals of controlling pollutants emitted from coal refuse to energy facilities and ensuring that regulations imposed on the industry are fair and allow vital remediation work to continue. The people who live near coal refuse piles and all the communities downstream of these hazards expect us to find a solution. The industrious men and women at the power plants, on the coal refuse piles, and throughout the supply chain are counting on us to protect their livelihoods. We owe it to all of them to pass the Sense Act. Again, I thank the committee for holding this important hearing, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Well, Congressman Rothfus, thank you very much for being with us today. And as much as we'd like to ask you questions, we're going to dismiss you because we have another panel and we're going to be asking them a lot of questions. But I want to thank you again for your leadership in bringing this to our attention, and we all look forward to working with you to try to move this legislation to provide some assistance.
Thank you, Chairman.
So thank you very much.
Committee.
Thank you. Now, at this time, I'd like to call up the witnesses on the second panel. We have 5 of them. We have Mr. Davis Henry, who's the president and CEO of Henry Brick. We have Mr. Creighton McAvoy, who's president of McAvoy Brick Company. We have Mr. Vincent Brasini, who's the Director of Environment Affairs for Olympus Power. And we have Mr. Dennis Beck, Chairman of the Western Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation. And we have Mr. John Walk, who's Senior Attorney and Clean Air Director at the Natural Resources Defense Council. So if you all would come forward and have a seat. I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning to discuss these 2 pieces of legislation. We know that all of you have your expertise, and we, as a committee, look forward to learning more about both of these bills and the impacts that they might have. So, Mr. Brasini, you'll be first, and so everyone make sure their microphones are on when you do speak so that our transcriber here can get everything down. But Mr. Brasini, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the Chair and the committee for holding today's hearing on the Sense Act. My name is Vince Brasini, and I'm the Director of Environmental Affairs for Olympus Power. Today I'm testifying on behalf of ERIPA, the Trade Association of the Coal Refuse to Energy Industry. ERIPA members' facilities remove and convert coal refuse from historic mining activities into environmentally beneficial electricity. In fact, our electricity is recognized in the Pennsylvania Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act. Coal refuse is a material that has been left behind by historic coal mining activities. This includes the mining and the processes which separated coal from rock and other carbonaceous material. The picture on the screen shows a coal refuse pile on the left, and on the right, the mine acid drainage that can emanate from these piles. If you look at the coal refuse pile picture, you can see the mine acid drainage polluted stream on the right and at the bottom of the coal refuse pile. The pink areas on the pile are evidence that this pile has previously burned. Where I come from, that material is called red dog. The next likely question is how much coal refuse is out there? No one really knows, but it's estimated to be about 2 billion cubic yards in Pennsylvania alone. And that's split about evenly between the bituminous region in the east or the western part of the state and the anthracite region in the western part of the eastern part of the state. This map shows the abandoned mine lands and the location of the coal refuse to energy plants in Pennsylvania. It also shows watersheds impacted by mining affected lands, including coal refuse piles. Everyone downstream of mining affected lands is impacted by the surface water pollution from these areas. The coal refuse to energy process consists of 3 basic steps. The coal refuse is screened and removed from the site and then hauled to the coal refuse to energy plant. The coal refuse is then burned with limestone in a fluidized bed combustor boiler to make steam to produce electricity. And that results in ash that meets the criteria for beneficial use in Pennsylvania, and that ash is returned to the mining affected lands and used to remediate and reclaim those areas. The coal refuse to energy process is the only process that permanently addresses the problems associated with coal refuse. Some key industry metrics in Pennsylvania are 1,500 megawatts of electric generating capacity, 11 million tons of coal refuse removed annually for fuel, over 205 million tons of coal refuse used so far for fuel, thousands of acres of land remediated and reclaimed, hundreds of miles of streams improved by elimination of acid mine drainage, 1,200 indirect jobs, or 1,200 direct jobs with a payroll in excess of $84 million per year, 4,000 indirect jobs in project management, engineering, operations, transportation, logistics, and skilled trades, property tax revenues to support local schools and communities, and over $10 million per year of business per facility into their local economy. Collectively, $150 million per year into Pennsylvania's economy. The regulatory issues being addressed by the Sense Act are the cross-state air pollution rule and the mercury and air toxic standards. While EPA has engaged in both verbal and written communications with EPA regarding the issues associated with coal refuse-fired boilers, EPA has failed to recognize the technical differences between coal-fired and coal-fired refuse boilers, and the unique multimedia benefits the coal refuse-fired boilers provide to Pennsylvania. The Sense Act, on the other hand, provides for very targeted, appropriate, achievable emission control requirements for certain of these units. Specifically, under the cross-state air pollution rule, the Sense Act continues Phase 1 sulfur dioxide allowance allocations to existing bituminous coal refuse-fired units only. But it preserves EPA's sulfur dioxide emissions budget by reallocating a percentage of allowances from retired units and two plants that were converted from coal to natural gas. However, it does not allow the transfer of these sulfur dioxide allowances to other units, and upon retirement, any banked sulfur dioxide allowances allocated under the Sense Act must be surrendered. These caveats prevented an economic windfall to these bituminous coal refuse-fired units, and most likely they result in less sulfur dioxide being emitted into the environment. In the case of the mercury and air toxic standards, the Sense Act adds an additional performance-based standard of 93% sulfur dioxide removal to the current acid gas standards for demonstration of compliance. This again provides for the necessary relief for the continued operation of the bituminous coal refuse-fired plants. The Sense Act is a reasonable and targeted effort to address the errors that EPA has made in Casper and MATS, and is very important to ensuring that these coal refuse-fired facilities remain able to conduct their business of reclaiming and recovering these mining-affected lands and providing high-quality, family-sustaining jobs in the communities in which these facilities are located. EPA would like to thank Representative Rothfus, and we urge you to support the Sense Act and its passage in this session of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bersini, and Mr. Beck, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Usually I don't need a microphone, but I'll tone myself down today. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and the rest of the committee members. My name is Dennis Beck. I'm president or chairman of the Western Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, otherwise known as WIPCAMR. We have a sister organization called EPCAMR, which is the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition. The coalition appreciates the opportunity to appear today and share our views and concerns on the effects of the waste coal to energy plants in restoring the degraded environment in coal-producing areas, especially in Pennsylvania. I'm expressing support for House Bill 3797, the Sense Act, which will help establish the standards for EPA to regulate waste coal to energy plants. Our efforts focus on returning abandoned mine lands and waste coal piles to productive use, improving water quality, and reducing hazards to health and safety. thus improving the local economy and enhancing the quality of life. Today, the runoff from these waste coal piles is polluting our surface and groundwater supplies for several miles around the piles, with other numerous impacts on our environment. Chemicals such as mercury, selenium, chromium, lead, aluminum, iron, and manganese are seeped out of these coal piles into our water systems, into our water supplies. Where I live in Cambria County, we're at the headwaters of the Ohio River, and Pennsylvania is also part of the headwaters for the Chesapeake Bay. So any pollution that rolls off these coal piles affects everyone downstream. Changes in the pH in these streams destroys aquatic life, from the macroinvertebrates to fish. None survive in it, from some of the pictures that Vince had shown. Here's an important part. If left alone, many of these piles will self-ignite. We've got 40 piles in the state of Pennsylvania that are burning at this time. In Lackawanna County, in 2014, Pennsylvania's DEP had to extinguish that pile. It cost them over $2 million to extinguish the one pile that was burning. The 3 cogeneration plants in my county have significantly improved and impacted our county. They've burned over 25 million tons of waste coal while supplying electricity to 280,000 residences. The 3 plants employ 200 people directly and indirectly 300 more. They've reclaimed over 525 acres of abandoned mine lands, contributed over $25 million to the local community since they've been put in place, and have won numerous state and environmental and safety awards since 1992. I just want to talk a little bit about 2 of the reclamation sites in Cambria County. In Revlock, the Blacklick Creek was a dead stream for several decades. That has been restored. Over 100 acres of land have been restored. The south branch of the Blacklick is now designated as a cold water fishery by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, and it's eligible for fish stocking for the local fishermen. In Washington Township, there's been 3.5 million tons of waste coal removed. In its place, there are 4 ball fields, 2.5 miles of walking trails, a community hall, a coal miners monument, and a bell tower. It's now a gathering place for the entire community, both young and old, improving the vitality of a once dying community. A contractor has also subdivided numerous acres for housing growth in that area. Another one of these big projects that was undertaken is called the Big Gorilla Project in northeast Pennsylvania. It cost DEP $4.5 million to reclaim those acres, and they estimated if the waste coal plants had not come in to take the waste coal out of there, that reclamation cost would have been $80 million. And it cost $4.5 million to get it cleaned up and restored. I want to look at net benefits. Several people have talked about reducing the benefits of cleaning these sites up and stuff that we've put on it. I've mentioned a couple of them. Let me just mention what would happen if they're not cleaned up. There's over 5,000 piles of waste coal left in Pennsylvania. There's 40 of them burning at this time. If they're left alone, numerous more are going to self-ignite. And what comes off of those piles in the smoke and the steam that come off of there are, again, your mercury, your sulfates, your chlorides, hydrogen sulfide. You got polycyclic organics, which are phenols coming off of there in that smoke. There's 40 piles. Furthermore, let me mention this one also. EPA has indicated from past statements that because of the unique environmental benefits that coal refuse-fired electric generating units provide, these units warrant special consideration so as to prevent the amended NSPS, the New Source Performance Standards, from discouraging the construction of future coal refuse-fired plants in the U.S. And that's in the ERIPA report that was updated. It's a white paper updated on October 5th of 2015. We feel that it's not equitable and one regulation does not fit all the plants the same. It's an overburdening and unfair regulation, and we support Representative Rothfus's House bill that will examine the EPA regulation on emissions of these waste coal plants. We feel that waste coal plants provide a greater benefit to the environment, communities, and residents of the unregulated coal mining regions of the past. The amount of pollution removed and streams restored to new life must be considered as greatly beneficial to the people of the United States.
Mr. Beck, excuse me, I've let you go over about a minute and a half, so.
3 lines.
Okay.
These waste plants are a great example of ingenuity, cutting-edge technology, and concern for the environment. The positive impact of the waste coal burning plants include enhancements on land, water, air, living organisms, as well as the social, cultural, and economic environments. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Mr. Walk, welcome back. We appreciate your being here this morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and members of the committee. It's good to be back. My name is John Walk, and I am Clean Air Director and Senior Attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, a nonprofit organization of scientists, lawyers, and environmental specialists dedicated to protecting public health and the environment. H.R. 3797, the Satisfying Energy Needs and Satisfying the Environment Act, is a flawed bill that would weaken air pollution standards for waste coal plants and increase dangerous and deadly pollution under 2 of the most important clean air rules ever adopted for coal-burning power plants. I am not here to dispute or to debate beneficial uses of waste coal to energy production, as Congressman Pallone noted. H.R. 3797 will, however, increase emissions of harmful sulfur dioxide and particulate matter pollution, as well as hazardous air pollution in states with coal plants. This will impose additional avoidable health hazards on Americans. My oral testimony will make 4 basic points. First, H.R. 3797 picks winners and losers under EPA's signature interstate air pollution program, the cross-state rule. It does so by favoring waste coal power burning plants at the expense of all the other in-state power plants that generate electricity with other types of coal or oil. H.R. 3797 even deprives some of these other coal plant operators of valuable economic assets to which they are entitled under current law. This political favoritism upends the neutral, performance-based legal system that Congress has maintained for interstate air pollution for 39 years. H.R. 3797 deprives valuable allowances from non-waste coal plant operators that make cleaner decisions. This deters cleaner generation and penalizes other in-state coal-burning power plant operators. H.R. 3797 penalizes the coal plant operators that do not burn waste coal by reducing valuable sulfur dioxide allowances that the operator is entitled to hold or trade or sell under current law. This especially harmful element of the bill has the unjustified effect of rewarding dirtier operation by waste coal plants and penalizing less polluting decisions by coal plant operators to switch to natural gas or cease operation. Indeed, were this legislation to become law, the bill would create immediate disincentives to repowering coal units to natural gas or shutting down older, inefficient units. This is not good public policy. Second, the bill attacks state rights under the Clean Air Act. The legislation deprives state officials of the flexibility and prerogative to determine from which in-state sources sulfur dioxide reductions are best secured to comply with the cross-state rule, and how to achieve those reductions most effectively, equitably, and cost-effectively. The legislation would take control away from states to make these basic decisions for the first time in the 39-year history of the Clean Air program. Remarkably, the bill even goes on to place the U.S. EPA administrator in charge of decisions that the Clean Air Act today reserves to states. If state officials in Pennsylvania or West Virginia, for example, wish to incentivize the waste coal energy industry, they may do so today under current law. State officials may grant more sulfur dioxide allowances to waste coal plant operators from the state's total emission budget under the cross-state rule. There is no need to pass legislation like this to accomplish that. Indeed, the bill would paradoxically deny state officials the flexibility and authority that they enjoy under today's law. Third, the bill allows unhealthy levels of sulfur dioxide pollution to increase above a state's total budget level, worsening air quality in upwind and downwind states. Due to a fatal flaw in the bill discussed in my written testimony, there is no constraint in the real world on the sulfur dioxide emissions exceeding a state's overall pollution budget. The result would be more pollution in upwind and downwind states. Fourth and finally, the bill harms Americans' health and air quality by letting waste coal plants emit excessive levels of dangerous, hazardous air pollution. It adds an alternative, more lax emission standard for sulfur dioxide emissions to the two more protective standards in the rule already. EPA has noted that some waste coal plants already are meeting either the rule's sulfur dioxide standard or hydrogen chloride standard, or both. Others will do so by April of this year after seeking compliance extensions and installing available pollution controls to meet their standards. When waste coal plants owners filed lawsuits challenging the mercury rule, claiming it was, quote, virtually impossible to meet the acid gas and sulfur dioxide limits, the court had little trouble rejecting these arguments unanimously. The judges pointed to evidence showing that 8 out of 19 waste coal units with data already could meet the rule's acid gas standard or alternative sulfur dioxide standard. Indeed, the court noted that some of these already compliant plants are among the best performers. Let me repeat that, among the best performers in achieving hydrogen chloride reductions among all coal-burning power plants around the country. Finally, H.R. 3797 would allow higher levels of sulfur dioxide emissions and hazardous air pollution. This outcome is harmful for Americans living in states with these coal plants and harmful to Americans living downwind from these plants. This, too, is bad public policy, and I urge members of the committee not to approve the bill. Thank you.
Mr. Walk, thank you very much. And Mr. Henry, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you for inviting me to testify.
Have you turned your mic on?
Sorry about that. Chairman Whitfield and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to testify on this important issue. My name is Davis Henry, and I'm the president of Henry Brick, which has manufactured clay brick in Selma, Alabama for over 70 years. I represent the third generation of Henrys to operate this plant. I also currently serve as the vice chairman of the board for the Brick Industry Association, the national trade association that represents manufacturers and distributors of clay brick and pavers. I'm here today to speak on behalf of both my company and my industry. Henry Brick currently employs 58 people, including our manufacturing, sales, and support staff. That number hopefully will grow this year to about 95 when we bring Plant 2 back online. It has been idle since June of 2008 due to the economy. As you can imagine, the last 8 years have been a very trying time for our company as well as the rest of the brick industry. We are committed to doing our share to protect our environment, but with a finite amount of resources, we need to be sure that we know what is required of us and that the expectations will not change once the resources are committed. I'm here today because we were directly impacted by a previous change in regulation, and I want to ensure that my company and all remaining brick companies do not fall victim to this again. In 2003, the first Maximum Achievable Control Technology, or MACT, standard was promulgated for our industry. This rule applied only to major sources of hazardous air pollutants, or HAP, and only to the larger kills in our industry. For our industry, with only 2 pollutants emitted in any large amount, the only definition of major source that really applies is a facility that has the potential to emit 10 tons or more of any single HAP. Henry Brick was a major source of HAP in 2003 and had 2 kills considered to be large by the EPA. We had until 2006 to install and begin operating control devices to meet the limits, which we did. We installed limestone-based systems called DLAs, or dry lime absorbers, on both our kills at a total capital cost of about $1.5 million. In 2007, almost a full year after our industry achieved compliance with the 2003 MACT, it was vacated by the courts for deficiencies. Unfortunately, most of us, including Henry Brick, were unable to turn off our control devices because our existing air permits would not allow us to stop operating the controls. The cost to operate the control devices over the last 8+ years has been significant as well. During the compliance time for the 2003 Brick MAC, the number of controlled kills in our industry soared from just over 20 to more than 100 kills. In 2008, they began developing the replacement MAC that eventually became the 2015 Brick MAC. To develop the standard, the EPA looked at the best performing kills, including those brand new controls that would not have been in place except for the 2003 Brick MAC, to establish the limits. Unfortunately, like many who installed DLAs, our kills cannot meet these new, more stringent limits. We recently conducted a stack test at our facilities that confirmed our inability to meet the limits for two of the three HAP categories. We cannot meet the mercury limit nor the PM non-mercury metals limit. To comply with the 2015 BRIC MAC, we believe we would need to take out the DLAs we installed in 2006 and install a new system called a dry injection fabric filter. The EPA estimates this would cost us about $3.8 million, almost $8 million to our company. There is an alternate solution that may be as little as $1.65 million, but it's not been proved, and we don't know how that'll pan out. The EPA's estimated emission reduction for an average kill for mercury metals is less than 400 pounds per year for an uncontrolled source. So our incremental reduction from our controlled kills would be even less. There is a way to avoid MAC compliance. In fact, the EPA's first listed option for complying with the rule is to avoid the rule by becoming a synthetic miner or synthetic area source. To become a synthetic area source, a facility accepts federally enforceable limits that ensures they never emit more than the 10 tons per year that makes you a major source. If you're like Henry Brick and have both of your kills controlled with air pollution control devices, EPA assumes that you can become a synthetic area source at little or no cost. If you follow EPA's approach to assigning cost, you would assign an annual cost of less than $20,000 per year. Unfortunately, our most recent tests also demonstrate that we cannot become a synthetic area source as we currently operate. We have some issues with raw material and other things that it's going to cost money to solve these issues, and it'll be a lot more than $20,000. While compliance with this regulation alone threatens small businesses like Henry Brick, if you consider that this is the only regulation we face, correctly identifying the appropriate place to spend our finite sources is critical to our survival. For example, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is about to finalize a new permissible exposure limit for silica dust that, if promulgated as it was proposed, will add almost another $1 million in equipment that my company may need to finance and install to remedy a non-existent silicosis threat in brick plants. Regulations like these threaten the continued existence of many small companies in our industry, including mine. In fact, compliance with both of these rules at the same time could devastate much of our already threatened industry, where 75% of the companies are small businesses. Henry Brick simply cannot afford to try to hit another potentially moving target of BRIC MAC compliance. We acted in good faith to comply with the 2003 BRIC MAC and now face some of the steepest costs in the industry because we may need to take out our DLAs and replace them with DIFs. We need the BRIC Act to ensure that we're not required to invest again until we know that the standard is not going to change. This is not a hypothetical issue for Henry Brick. It is real. It has happened to us. Please do not let it happen again. Thank you for introducing this bill and for taking the time to listen to me today. I'm happy to answer any additional questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. McAvoy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to testify on this issue that could have potentially devastating consequences to my company and to my industry. My name is Creighton McAvoy. I am president of the McAvoy Brick Company, which has manufactured clay brick and pavers in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania for over 120 years. However, my family history with brick making goes back 5 generations to 1866, when my grandfather started a brick plant in Philadelphia with his brother-in-law. He eventually started 2 more brick yards in South Philadelphia with his sons. And in 1895, he and his sons started a new corporation to make vitrified street pavers in Phoenixville. We are still making brick on that site today. In 2006, McAvoy Brick employed 26 hourly union employees and 6 salaried employees working year-round and had sales of over $5.5 million. In 2012, due to the effects of the Great Recession on our industry, McAvoy Brick sales bottomed out at just under $2.5 million. And we employed 4 salaried employees and 20 hourlies, most of which were laid off 5 to 6 months of that year. Last year, business slightly improved to just under $2.8 million in sales, and employment increased to 5 salaried employees and 21 hourly employees, most of which were employed over 8 months. Throughout all this downturn, McAvoy Brick has been able to pay all its bills and, for the most part, stay in the black. As you can see, we are a very small business, even for the brick industry. I am here today because while we were not required to put on controls in the last round of this regulation, it appears we will need to under this new rule. We are concerned that this regulation could become the moving target that the last Brick Mac did, and that regulatory uncertainty could cripple my ability to remain in business. We are here to ask your help to ensure that what happened to companies like Henry Brick does not happen again. We believe the Brick Act can give us this certainty we need. I am not only here on behalf of my company, I am here on behalf of my industry, as I serve on the board of directors of the Brick Industry Association. Approximately 75% of the companies in the brick industry are small businesses like McAvoy Brick. They have been making brick for 100 years or more and have been good employers and neighbors in their local communities. Our industry is committed to do our share and doing the right thing for our employees, our vendors, our customers, and our community. However, as our industry continues to struggle to come out of the Great Recession, we, like all industries, have limited resources. It is imperative that these limited resources be used judiciously and on the most important issues. It is important that there is some benefit to every dollar spent and that the money not be spent needlessly or prematurely. We were actually one of the fortunate companies when it came to the 2003 Brick Mac, as we were able to take a production limit from 12 tons of brick per hour through our kiln down to just below 10 tons per hour, making our kiln a small kiln and not subject to those regulations. That did not come without a cost, as we could have sold some of the product from that surrendered capacity in the few years before the recession. However, we were still better off than what compliance did to our fellow brick manufacturers with large kilns. In 2015, the 2015 Brick Mac does include some of the innovative requirements, including health-based standards for over 99% of the hazardous air pollutants emissions from our industry's kilns. Unfortunately, the requirement for the remaining 1% emissions, mercury and non-mercury metals, will require the same multi-million-dollar controls that would have been required before the health-based standard was conceived. Under the 2015 Brick Mac, we will likely be required to install controls on our kiln. We will be conducting tests to determine our specific situation. According to EPA's cost estimates, they expect that we will install and operate a control device that will cost approximately $1.5 million and become a synthetic minor source, thus avoiding the Brick Mac requirements. This control device is the same one Henry Brick installed on their kilns. If that control is incapable of helping us get out of this rule, as it was incapable for Henry Brick, we believe we will have to install a control system that EPA estimates at costing $2.7 million to control 3 to 5 pounds of mercury and 100 to 200 pounds of metals each year. We are simply not sure anyone will loan us the money to purchase these controls, or that we will be able to pay this money back, particularly if it is for these more expensive system that has never been demonstrated to work on a brick kiln emission. While we did not have experience complying with control limits for the 2003 Brick Mac, Another small company similar to ours does have experience trying to borrow money from a financial institution. In their case, the money was for renovations of one of their kilns and an investment that would make them more efficient and more productive. They spent the last 2 years trying to obtain financing for a renovation of one of their kilns. This renovation would reduce their energy cost by approximately $500,000 per year, and it took 2 years to find a financial institution willing to lend them the money. That company is one of the few brick companies to have had steady profits since 2007. Their financial status was very good for all those loan applications with plenty of collateral. However, it still took 2 years to find an institution willing to lend them the funds.
Mr. McAvoy, I've let you go over about 2 minutes if you would summarize your testimony.
You may think that the loss of one small brick company will not make any difference in our overall economy. However, if McAvoy Brick is required to close our doors, more than $2.8 million will be lost from our local economy. We pay over $1 million in wages for 26 families. Many of these employees will have difficulty finding other employment. Basically, we are really happy that this legislation has been introduced, and we hope that it'll be able to be passed. I thank the committee for allowing me the time to speak, and I will be more than happy to answer any question at this time.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. And at this time, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes questions. Mr. Henry, how many employees do you have in your company?
Currently 58.
58, and you had 26 families, Mr. McAvoy? Yeah. You know, recently I was reading an article about, and this article happened to be talking about some environmental groups who basically were saying that the end justifies the means. And that struck a chord with me because you look at the BRIC Act of 2003, that regulation which was vacated by a federal court. You look at the Utility Act, the Supreme Court recently found that rule to be legally flawed and remanded it back to EPA. And the day after the Supreme Court's decision, EPA said in a blog that the Supreme Court ruling was of no practical impact, stating that the majority of power plants are already in compliance with our regulation, are well on their way to compliance. It is disturbing to me personally that EPA seems to be developing a pattern, and they're doing the same thing with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Energy Plan, in which they, even Larry Tribe says, it looks like you're burning up the Constitution, what you're doing here. And now it's at the Supreme Court on whether or not there's going to be a stay to the implementation of this act or not. But they seem to be developing a pattern of they come forth with these regulations, knowing full well the only avenue open to a company is to file a lawsuit, or an association or groups to file lawsuits, knowing full well that that's going to take a period of time, and the deadline for meeting the regulation is going to expire before that can be decided in the courts. And so that's a disturbing trend. And it seems to me that both of you in the brick industry are concerned about that with this 2015 Act, that you're going to have to comply, you're going to have to spend the money, and the lawsuits are going to be filed, and you may end up winning, but in effect, it's a hollow victory. Would you agree with that comment or not?
Certainly. When we came into compliance in 2006 with the original MACT, as I stated, we spent $1.5 million. A year later, it was vacated. We've had to operate those control devices since 2007, regardless of whether there was a MACT in place or not. So we've spent no telling how much money over that time operating them. And now to be faced with having to replace those with new control devices that are exponentially higher in cost for only a 4% gain or reduction in emissions seems outrageous.
You know, we all recognize the Clean Air Act is a very important piece of legislation, and I don't think America has to take a back seat to anyone on a clean environment, and we can credit the Clean Air Act for it. But I do think we have to be concerned when a pattern is developing where they're going so extreme on some of these regulations they cannot withstand legal challenge, and yet the practical impact is that it makes no difference because there's no avenue available. So I think that's something we're all concerned about. Let me just ask you on the coal refuse issue and the brick, have you all had a lot of discussions with EPA about your particular problem?
Yes, in fact, those discussions occurred. There were meetings on February 29th, 2012, May 30th, 2012, March 19th, 2013, May 7th, 2013, November 5th, 2013.
And do you feel like you're making any progress in working out a solution with EPA on this?
Not at this point, no.
Okay.
We don't believe.
What about the brick industry? Have you all been meeting with them as well?
Oh, yes, we have. We've worked with them, and we were also able to get a health-based rule, which is somewhat groundbreaking.
So they've been it's been productive for you.
Oh yeah, it's been productive. However, other issues come up, the mercury and the metals, and it just also seems like, you know, outside sources suing, you know, cause these problems.
Suing to making them to comply.
Well, making the change to vacate the rule.
Yeah, right. To vacate. Yeah, right. Well, yeah, it is it's really frustrating, and my time's expired. So, Mr. McNerney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman. Today's hearing focuses on a couple of bills. Oh, sorry. That was my opening statement.
It is a couple of bills.
We've heard today that the coal refuse facilities are unable to meet the EPA mercury and air toxic standards. But this isn't the first time we've heard that kind of claim, that they can't meet the EPA standards, only later to find out that the innovation made the standards achievable at minimal cost. Mr. Walke, it's my understanding that the EPA used their maximum achievable control technology program in setting up the mercury and air toxic standards. Could you briefly describe how that program works?
Sure. The Clean Air Act's air toxic program requires the EPA to look at the best performers in reducing toxic air pollution. EPA did so for coal electric plants and found that waste coal plants were among the very best in the country, among all coal plants, including those that burn bituminous, lignite, and otherwise, in reducing the HCl emissions that are the subject of this bill and this hearing. The executive branch has found those emissions can be controlled. The judicial branch has found the same thing. State officials have found the same thing, and plant operators are meeting the standards with equipment that's running today.
Very good. So Congress, in setting up this program, did not want to merely maintain the status quo. Congress wanted all facilities within the industrial sector to make up the necessary upgrades to reduce their emissions in line with the best performing units. Is that right?
That's correct, sir. And if I just may add some important context to the discussion that just occurred, the federal court in 2003 that struck down the BRIC standard found that the Bush administration had adopted illegally weak rules that did not reflect what the best performers can do. The rule was overturned following urgings by the BRIC administration, the BRIC Industry Association, the trade group, to adopt those illegal elements in the rule, and that's why the courts overturned it. I agree it's an unfortunate situation, but if anything, the Bush administration induced these companies to install illegal and inadequate controls, and that was overturned in court, which is unfortunately where we are today.
Well, the advocates for this bill claim that the coal refuge facilities should be treated differently from other coal fuel generation facilities, that the technology and that the fuel used would prevent these facilities from meeting MATS standards. Did the EPA look at the coal refuge facilities while establishing the MATS standards? You sort of already answered that. Go ahead.
They absolutely did, and found them to be among the best performers, a conclusion that was validated by the court in rejecting the same arguments that you're now hearing from the waste coal industry when they were advanced unsuccessfully in a lawsuit.
Well, has the EPA considered treating these facilities differently from the other coal burning facilities?
They already do. They allow these plants alone to meet alternative limits of HCl or sulfur dioxide in the air toxics rule.
Is that appropriate?
And I think that's perfectly appropriate as long as they're strict. What this bill does is relax the sulfur dioxide limit. Another point is really critical. State officials today have the authority to treat these plants differently. They have the authority to exempt the plants from the cross-state rule. They have chosen not to do so. They have also chosen to give them their fair share of allowances, but that's a decision that can be changed by state officials tomorrow.
Well, in your testimony, you mentioned that the courts have also considered challenges to the mercury and air toxic rule based on assertions that the waste coal plants should regulate differently. Were these challenges successful?
They were not, because the assertions were found to be unfounded.
Well, based on your response, then, there appears to be no justification for allowing these facilities to emit more pollution than other similar facilities.
We certainly do not believe so, especially because we're talking about hazardous, toxic air pollution, and we're talking about pollution control devices that are both available and in use today.
Quickly, if you would, the results of this legislation would be, in my opinion, that other power plants in a given state covered by the CSARP would have to drastically cut their emissions to make up the differences. Is that appropriate?
That is a strange paradox of the bill. They favor waste coal plants by requiring all other coal burning plants in a state with waste coal plants to give up quite valuable assets, these sulfur dioxide allowances that can be traded or sold or used at a later time. So it's a zero-sum game, and the bill takes it out of the hide of remaining coal plant operators.
Very good. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great hearing to have, and it's unfortunate we have two different, same but two different, because I'd like to get in depth on both of them, and I'm going to try to. First of all, I want to Mr. Henry and Mr. McAvoy, thank you for creating jobs and livelihood. Mr. McAvoy, what's your payroll? Approximately, I know you probably don't have those numbers in front of you.
$1 billion.
How much taxes do you pay?
You mean federal or whatever?
Federal, state, Illinois has property tax.
Well, property tax, I think, to the school district, I think we're like $60,000 a year. We're a subchapter S corporation, so I don't have a federal number.
And how about health care benefits that you provide?
About $20,000 a month or more.
Right, and these are bargained. Your hourly folks are bargained.
Yeah.
Correct. What's the union?
Steel workers.
Okay.
Steel workers.
So those are always important aspects to debate, because in my opening statement, the greatest driver of health concerns to our population is poverty. So it's an important debate to have, to how much you push on emissions for the sake of health when you drive people into poverty, or you cause them to lose their jobs, or you put them on the welfare state. So I want to continue. Thank you for fighting for that aspect. Let me go, Mr. Walken, I appreciate you being here, and I know the organization, the association, and you laid out a compelling case on technology in the Sense Act, but you made no comment on, you didn't make another credible defense of technology in respect to the BRIC Act. In fact, you said nothing about the BRIC Act. Can you tell me why?
Sure. I was invited to testify about the Sense Act. I have some familiarity with the BRIC rule, and I related some of that. Mr. Shimkus, I'll try my best to answer your questions, but I didn't prepare a written testimony.
Okay, because obviously the brick industry, the debate is also rules, regulations we tried to meet. Now they're changing the rules. Now we may not be able to meet it, and so that would be, if you would, that'd be helpful to me if you would come, because it's just important in this debate, the cost-benefit analysis. Let me go to the kind of segueing now to the Sense Act. Back to you, Mr. Walk. I mean, those photos that was put up by, I think, Mr. Brazzini are fairly compelling on reclamation and reuse. But in your opening statement, you also said, I'm not going to dispute or discuss. You didn't want to talk about those benefits. Why not?
I wasn't disagreeing with those benefits, is what I meant to.
So if there are, so that's part of this debate. If there are benefits, and you all accept that premise, can't we get to how do we incentivize this that's beneficial to the health and the environment of our citizens based upon those very compelling photos? I mean, in there, I think part of the Sense Act is let's help each other. Let's help clean up the environment, but let's give a benefit for the reuse so that this can happen in an affordable. I think the other compelling thing Mr. Beckett mentioned was the reclamation of this site. The cost could have been $60 million, ended up being $4 million. From a taxpayer's perspective, that's hard to argue. The benefits.
And I'm not. I have three specific ideas, and let me use Pennsylvania as an example, that state officials can do today without needing to resort to a lot of the
But they have to take from emissions of current operating facility. I mean, so if there's a set standard, and then you penalize, we don't incentivize this, and they give them the credits that then the proposal is to take away from other operating facilities. I need to go to, and I apologize because we really don't have much time. I want to give Mr. Brazzini a chance to respond to some of the claims Mr. Walk made as far as the litigation, Bush administration, and a response. Could you do that for me?
I would love to, thank you. Let's talk about MACT. What MACT did in that regulation, EPA lumped two groups. They said, your coal or your lignite. There was no differentiation between coal refuse, and I believe they kept coal refuse because of the exact reason Mr. Walk mentioned. We are extremely low emitters of mercury, so they need to lump them in to the larger group so they can force the lowest mercury limit on the coal-fired plants. Also, we're extremely low emitters of particulate matter. They use a non-metal mercury particulate alternative standard. Again, we helped set the bar lower for the other plants. But once we got drug in to allow that to happen, at that point, we have HCl. I do not agree with what he said around these plants being able to meet hydrochloric acid. There are actually 2 bituminous plants that can meet the hydrochloric acid. No other plants, whether they are bituminous coal refuse or anthracite coal refuse. They don't do it. One is the last plant built in 2004, and there's a particularly unique sulfur dioxide control system, which as a co-benefit happens to control control hydrochloric acid. The other unit happens to burn coal refuse that doesn't have chlorine. In fact, to control mercury at that plant, you need a halogen, be it chlorine. They use bromine. And that's how they are able to capture the mercury, because you can't capture mercury unless it's oxidized. You can't oxidize the mercury unless there's a halogen present. Now, as far as the authority to exempt, or I can do a surgical reallocation tomorrow, no, they can't. This is a FIP. This is a federal implementation plan. And to change that federal implementation plan, you need a new state implementation plan. EPA has up to 18 months to respond to a federal implementation plan change. So the idea that I can come in there and fix this tomorrow is not true. And I will say it that bluntly. Now, as far as increasing emissions and having emissions increase, no, we preserve the budget, but we don't take anything away from an operating unit. There are a considerable number of units that have been retired in both Pennsylvania and in West Virginia that these are the source of the allowances. We do not increase the cap developed by EPA for Pennsylvania for SO2. We simply say, let's reallocate from the retired units, so units that are sitting there with this stuff that no longer provide jobs, no longer provide tax base, no longer provide the things that they previously provided, but we don't say take them all away. In Pennsylvania, the reallocation split would be 65 to 35. In West Virginia, it would be, they would retain 86% of the allowances, and the bituminous refuse plants would get 14% of the allowances. So there's a fundamental issue. Now, as far as there are some plants that are meeting the alternative sulfur dioxide standard. Yes, that's true. They are the anthracite plants. They have low sulfur coal refuse.
Thank you, Mr. Brazzini. We get into this issue when I always like to give people an opportunity to answer, particularly when they're asked the question with about 4 seconds left in it's an art. So thank you for your comments, and particularly that part about states being able to immediately give you an exemption. Mr. Doyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to maybe just go a little further with that, Mr. Brazzini. You acknowledge that some of these coal refuge plants that burn bituminous coal, even some that burn bituminous coal, are able to meet MATS and CASPER, and they've not asked for an extension to comply with the regs. You imply in your testimony that's so because they're burning low sulfur bituminous coal refuge. Are there any other distinguishing features at these plants that are able to comply? Are there any technologies that other plants could adopt to mitigate the release of these pollutants and comply with the standards?
The circumstance you have is that there's one bituminous plant that meets the HCL. They cannot meet, because they're a bituminous plant, they can meet the HCL, but they cannot meet the current alternate SO2 limit. The other plants that can meet the alternate SO2 limit are anthracite refuse plants in the eastern part of the state, but they don't meet the hydrochloric acid limit either. Only one other plant does, and there's no chlorine in the coal refuse that they burn.
So you're saying that there's no new technologies that are available that would allow them to comply?
I suppose that there would be a way, but we looked at a number of things to try to do that, including the ejection of additional limestone, but it ultimately ends up in increasing of mass emissions. And something else that happens is that there's varied sulfur content in the coal refuse piles in the bituminous region that can get even higher. To simply pick a number and not look at a performance-based standard for removal would eliminate the opportunity to pursue the highest sulfur coal piles, coal refuse piles, to reclaim them, and they probably have the highest level of acidic discharge with the greatest negative effect on a waterway.
I mean, couldn't some of these plants add another type of fuel or make the waste coal their secondary fuel source so that it reduces the sulfur or HCl and helps them comply with the standards? Is there an alternative way to
Not
do
really,
this?
no. Not from the standpoint of entering a different fuel. You can't start burning. Number one, there's limitations by virtue of financing and other issues that these coal plants are obligated to burn at least 75% waste, coal refuse. There's also, as you go through, there's chlorine in the coal that's also burned, but you can't dilute it. Plus, you're also limited into the calorific value that can go into a fluidized bed combustor. For example, the most recent one built, and as they build them to be able to burn lower and lower quality coal refuse. The older ones that were built require, they burned or designed to burn about 6,800 BTUs per pound for their heat input for their fuel. The most recent one built is at 5,500, and coal's generally 12 to 13,000 BTUs per pound.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask Mr. Walk, too. Mr. Walk, I understand and appreciate your concern that states maintain their rights under the Clean Air Act. But, you know, in my state, particularly in Pennsylvania, many elected officials in my state strongly value these coal refuge plants on both sides of the aisle, I might add. And our own DEP, Pennsylvania's Department of DEP, submitted official comments to the EPA urging special consideration of the coal refuge-fired facilities under Casper. In their comments, they explain the importance of these facilities to restoring the environment and preventing acid mine drainage. They ultimately concluded that constructing a rule that results in the closure of these facilities will have significant impacts on my state's ability to restore these mine-affected areas to benefit our state and our downstream neighbors. What do you recommend the Pennsylvania DEP should do going forward?
Congressman Doyle, thank you for your thoughtful question, and I did read those very thoughtful comments by the Pennsylvania DEP. Several things that can be done, and some of them are actually mentioned in the letter. States today have the authority to differently allocate allowances within the emitters in their state. They can do it to other coal-burning electric utilities. They can do it to non-electric sector. They have the full array of choice about how best to achieve those reductions cost effectively. So if Pennsylvania wants to incentivize waste coal energy production, they can do so by reallocating sulfur dioxide allowances within the electric sector. They can do a mix within the electric sector.
So they'd have to submit a new SIP, is that what you're saying?
I did not mean to suggest, and maybe I did by using tomorrow, that this could be accomplished by midnight tomorrow. Clearly not. But
It sounded that way when you said it.
Well, I apologize for that, that impression. The state has the authority to design their own plan to allocate things differently than the federal model. They have
so
chosen
that
not
gets
to do
them
so.
through Casper, but how does that get them to comply with MATS?
That's an excellent question. So you actually hit upon some of it yourself. There are plants in West Virginia, for example, that are using waste coal as a secondary fuel that are installing scrubbers and meeting the standard. They will do so by April. There are Pennsylvania plants who have told the state that they will undertake limestone injection in order to satisfy the standard. EPA found that there are scrubbers that can reduce emissions by 96% of sulfur dioxide. The bill, of course, weakens that standard. So there are waste coal plants across the country complying with this standard, or that will be complying with the standard, with off-the-shelf technology that is available, and EPA and the courts have both found that to be the case.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Yes, sir. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for conducting today's hearing, and to our panel. Thanks very much for your testimony today. It's very enlightening. If I could just start maybe between Mr. Henry and Mr. McAvoy, to ask you some questions about the brick industry in general. Are bricks made all over the country? Are they regionalized? Where are most bricks being made at today?
I'm sorry, what was
where are the bricks being made at today? Is it
all over
regional or all over?
Predominantly in the southeast and up through the Atlantic East Coast, but there's brick plants located all over the country.
Because the next question I have is because bricks aren't light; they're pretty heavy. So I was just thinking on the transportation costs. You know, when you're looking at the transportation, how far you have to get to transport those bricks, and the question on the transportation costs, of course, when you look at the weight and the cost there, when you're having these costs being associated with the EPA coming down on you, you're going to have to pass those costs on. I would assume you're doing that. So, Mr. McAvoy, you're shaking your head. If you'd like to comment on that. If you'd like to comment on that. Well, again, when you're looking at absorbing by you, because with I'm not sure exactly what your margins are, but you're going to have to somehow get that cost down to the on the construction industry. But then that's going to be passed on to the ultimate. It's going to be either that homeowner out there that wants to build a new house that's going to have to pay the more cost for the brick. Or if there's a hardworking American out there that wants to build a new factory or a plant or some type of a business that they're going to use some type of a brick product, that's going to have to be added into that cost, I would assume.
So just in general, over the last, could you give me an idea maybe over like the last, since these regulations have come on, which you've seen that you might see an average cost of a brick going up that would be passed on then to the ultimate consumer of that brick? Or just an approximate, if you can do that. You might need, you know, right. Well, let me ask this, Mr. Henry, if I could. The EPA estimates that this rule would have an annual cost in the neighborhood of $25 million, while the Chamber of Commerce report cites industry estimates as high as $100 million. You know, would you like to comment on that difference between, if you have any knowledge on that, from the EPA estimate at $25 million to the Chamber estimating at $100 million? How, you know, we're talking $75 million. There's quite a bit of difference there. Mr. McAvoy? Where's the EPA get their data from that they're coming up with that estimate, that $25 million? Okay. Mr. Versini, if I could ask you a quick question with my last 35 seconds. I'll try to do better than the gentleman from Illinois with only 4 seconds. Are co-refuse energy facilities typically located in smaller communities? Are these co-refuse energy facilities typically located in a smaller community or a larger community?
The co-refuse plants are located in small communities. They're extremely important to the small communities. In the case of the 3 bituminous co-refuse plants that are near where I live in Ebensburg, it's the county seat of Cambria County. It's less than 4,000 people population.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding the hearing today. I want to thank our witnesses for coming and testifying. Mr. Beck, in 2014, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection submitted comments to the Environmental Protection Agency. In these comments, the Pennsylvania DEP requested an exemption for coal waste facilities. DEP further recommended EPA establish a subcategory for waste coal technology. Can you offer your thoughts on why your state agency submitted these comments? Oh, Mr. Beck, you're chair of the Coalition of Abandoned Mines. Why did your state environmental agency submit those comments?
Why did they what?
Yeah, why did they submit those comments about recommending the EPA establish a subcategory for waste coal technology? Your state environmental agency submitted comments to EPA, and was there any reason for it, or did they do studies, research?
Mr. Versini worked for
through
DEP too, so I think
I can explain. And it gets back to the point I made about how they did MACT. When EPA did MACT, they did not.
Could you pull the mic a little closer?
Yeah, sure. They did not establish separate categories for coal refuse or different types of coal, anthracite coal or bituminous coal. They lumped it. It turned into 2 categories: lignite, everybody else. So the point that was being made is to appropriately address and prepare appropriate standards for the coal refuse plants, you should look at the emissions that are achieved by the coal refuse plants. That's how you do a MACT regulation. You look at the top 12% of the performing existing facilities, and you pick from those numbers. That's exactly why they put them together, though, because they wanted the mercury number to be as low as possible.
Most of the testimony offered today highlights the environmental benefits of the coal waste technology. In 2011, however, the Clean Air Council submitted comments to EPA stating a more environmentally friendly way of dealing with waste coal would be more cost-effective as well. Can any of the panel comment on the Clean Air Council's proposal to plant, for example, beach grass, and if their comment holds true?
Well, we've tried to investigate the beach grass claim, and what they did, and I've only ever been able to find an overview of the study. I've never found a study. I've never found background information on the particular pile they wanted to introduce the beach grass to. The fundamental premise of that study is they want to introduce beach grass, and it will grow for a period of time, and then they'll start to repopulate, and then other native species will overtake the refuse pile. We don't believe that that addresses the issue because it doesn't address percolation, surface runoff, and it doesn't prevent future fires from occurring within the piles, because a coal refuse fire does not start on the top by somebody throwing a match on it. It starts from the inside. In my written testimony, I've provided a coal refuse white paper that discusses refuse fires and those sorts of things. But no, we do not believe beach grass is any solution. I kind of look at it as, you know, somebody's coming and you want to clean up the house, so you throw the stuff in the closet.
Okay. Mr. Walker, in your testimony, you cite White Stallion. In that case, the D.C. court states, among other things, that EPA notes that CFBs were among the best and worst performers of various pollutants. Is the technology and retrofitting the difference between the best and the worst in the categories discussed by the D.C. court?
Well, the D.C. court upheld EPA's standard in all respects, and that finding wasn't challenged by the Supreme Court with respect to the standards themselves and the achievability of the standards and the propriety of the emission limits. EPA did create a separate subcategory for the lignite coal in your state, Congressman Green, and there are technologies that are more appropriate to lignite, but the court specifically rejected a challenge by the Trade Association for the Waste Coal Industry and said EPA was correct not to have established a subcategory for waste coal, and then Pennsylvania DEP asked EPA to reconsider that after the failed court challenge.
Mr. Chairman, in our district, and you've heard over the years, I have 5 refineries that generate tons of petroleum coke that we can't burn. And we're lucky enough to have a ship channel where we load it onto a ship and send it to Africa, India, wherever else. That's not possible in Pennsylvania because the rail cost, the transportation to somewhere would be, I guess, huge and so economically disadvantaged. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, and it's important to note where there is agreement here. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be able to combust this, and they're not arguing that they shouldn't have to control emissions. What we're arguing about is whether the standards that have been issued by EPA and upheld by the courts and that are being achieved today and that will be achieved with available technology should be weakened by this bill or allowed to continue.
This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose I probably want to, and I really want to just address the Sense Act over the coal refuse legislation. I'm trying to take it from a little bit different perspective, maybe from 30,000 feet, and that is all these new standards. Just imagine there would be so much less acrimony and differences of opinion, particularly back to you, Walk, if these were applicable only to new construction. If a new coal refuse facility had to be constructed, it has to follow these new standards. What I find offensive here in Washington is these new standards are put together, and then they're applied retroactively back to existing facilities. I come from the construction industry, and I can just assure you right now that the Cannon office building doesn't comply with all the proper indoor air quality standards. It's laden with asbestos, but yet we don't go back and make them retroactively address that unless we're going to do a major renovation. This room in and of itself also doesn't comply with indoor air quality standards of air turnovers. Neither does the Cannon office building. The Capitol building doesn't comply, but yet we're allowed to continue to use it. We walk across floor tile that's laden with asbestos. We've got asbestos in our plaster walls, and it's okay. But yet you go after a coal refuse to energy facility and say these new standards, you have to go back and retroactively do that. I just think it's disingenuous the way we approach some of these things, and I think it's a disservice to the taxpayers and anyone else that when we apply, in your words, picking winners and losers. In schools and office buildings, we don't make them go back and retroactively do that, but yet we're doing it to industry. We're doing it to the coal industry. And I'm troubled with that. Now, and I just know that we'd have a lot less acrimony. I think we could get along with a lot of our regulations if we impose a new reg was only applicable to new construction, a new power plant, not to go back and shut them down. And I'm a little concerned because I'm hearing from testimony from and reading the document that when we have two facilities in my district in West Virginia, they're going to shut down under these standards. And we're treating as though as they're not being truthful. Said they can do it. I guess they can if they can get the money to do it, and people are willing to pay the additional cost of energy that they're going to create as a result of that. And apparently what they have found out that there's no interest in that. The people that are consuming don't want to pay that, so they're going to close down. And we're talking about in these two over $3 million in taxes that will be lost as a result of it. Those 60% of that in West Virginia goes for schools. We've just cut out another $1.8 million, almost $2 million from our schools in West Virginia to accomplish something that should go forward, not retroactive. What are we thinking about when it comes to that? I'll go to you, Walk. Is it more responsible to say go ahead into the future? Wouldn't you find we would have more common interest if we use common sense to apply these regs, whether it's new source performance standards, all of this and this? Wouldn't it be better if we just applied it to new construction rather than old construction?
Congressman, thank you. I don't think so. And when the 1990 law was passed to establish...
So do you think we should shut down the Cannon office building then and make sure everyone leaves there? Because we're not in conformity with the standards that have been adopted across this country.
So this clean air program was
This is indoor air
for...
quality, though, Walk. That's what I'm talking about. You're subjecting all these people to have indoor air quality that is detrimental to their health. Indoor, we spend 90% of our time indoors, and we're not complying with the indoor air quality standards. But we allow that to continue because we understand the problems would be if we tried to make retroactively address old buildings. Why aren't we looking at it into the future? Don't you think, my time's over, I'm going to submit that if we made it effective to new construction, new brick plants, new coal to refuse, coal energy, that we would not have this problem right now, that they would be designed accordingly and they would be built into the cost. But to do this retroactively is not common sense. And I yield back my time. Thank you.
This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walk, I have a series of questions I'd like to ask you. One of them was touched on when you had an exchange with Mr. Doyle, so I'd like to
ask you to emphasize certain things. We've heard a testimony today that all waste coal plants can meet the mercury standard under MATS, but many cannot meet the hydrogen standard or the sulfur dioxide standards. Firstly, do you agree with that assessment? And in your answer, if possible, could you discuss the D.C. Circuit Court's decision in White Stallion Energy Center versus EPA?
Certainly. Thank you, Congressman. Let me take those one by one. One thing that hasn't come out yet at this hearing is that one of the reasons waste coal plants are meeting the mercury standard and the particulate matter standard is they qualify for an exemption, the low emitter exemption, where they're not actually, I mean, I guess you could call that meeting the standard, but they qualify for a low emitter exemption, which I think is appropriate. Other plants have coal profiles, coal waste profiles, or controls in place to achieve compliance. It is simply incorrect to suggest that coal waste plants burning any type of coal waste are incapable of achieving either the HCl or the SO2 standard in the existing MATS rule. The court rejected that claim. EPA has rejected that claim. What you have here is a case of, you know, if I can say so, special pleading to Congress to try to overturn those findings. We have applications submitted from coal waste operators announcing the controls they are going to install. We have controls that are going to go into place by April of this year. We have controls on plants already that are being operated. So when the D.C. Circuit in its decision heard the full legal arguments from the Trade Association for Waste Coal Operators and looked at all the evidence they presented and the evidence in the administrative record that EPA had compiled, they squarely rejected those claims in a 3-0 decision, and that decision was left untouched by the Supreme Court in that relevant respect.
Thank you. Janet McCabe, the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation of the EPA, submitted a written statement for today's hearing. She says that the bill we're discussing today would remove the economic incentives to reduce emissions at waste coal plants because emissions allocations for those plants could not be traded under the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CASPR. She argues that the result would be less efficient and more costly compliance with CASPR. Do you agree with her assessment?
Absolutely. It's just she's just describing the mechanics of the program. The units that were tired that were referred to by one of my fellow witnesses generated valuable allowances that are held by those coal operators and that can be used by those plants or that can be traded, and yet this bill would take them away. It would do the same for plants that converted to natural gas. There is a very robust market in tradable allowances that was created by the 1990 law and then continued in other forms. It's just inescapable that the design of this bill would take away those valuable assets from coal plant operators in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and elsewhere, and simply transfer them to waste coal operators who want to pollute at higher levels than the law today allows.
You mentioned that Section 2B of this bill would interfere with the state's rights to determine how to best comply with the requirements of the EPA's cross-state air pollution rule and favors waste coal burning plants over other in-state power plants. So this bill takes long-standing state authority, transfers it to the federal government, and then uses that authority to pick winners and losers. Is that right? And can you explain
That's
it?
right, and I find it a particular paradox for sponsors whose voting records in the past have suggested such strong support for states' rights. The law today is even-handed with respect to the decisions that state officials may make about how to allocate those allowances, and states make their own decision. This disrupts that, and for the first time in any interstate legislation I've ever seen, takes it away from the states and paradoxically transfers it up to Washington to override the ability of those states to make different allocation decisions. It's just puzzling.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Walk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Brasini, you want to make a comment?
I sure do. Thanks very much. I find it really interesting that we keep hearing this, well, this Sense Act picks winners and losers, when in fact the federal implementation plan picked the winners and losers. And they happen to pick in Casper the bituminous coal-fired refuse plants to be the losers in the Casper Phase 2 allocation. And they also picked the bituminous coal-fired refuse plants to be the loser in MATS. Because, as I've said all along, the anthracite refuse plants can meet the alternative 0.2 standard. That is because the sulfur content of the coal refuse in the anthracite region is lower. It's not because the technology is different or they have anything special. And it's part of the problem when you lump all of these things together, not recognizing the technical and the differences in these kinds of fuels.
Okay.
Now, as far as the idea that they're usurping states' rights, I find that interesting because the federal government just did that in the FIP. If you go on to read the Pennsylvania DEP comments, you will often find in the comments what happened to cooperative federalism. And that's really one of the arguments you have then.
Mr. Brasini, I'm going to, I'll give you a chance to respond there, but I need to recognize Mr.
I was going to ask Mr. Chairman if perhaps Mr. Wall could respond to something that Mr. Brasini.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me finish with these two, and then what we'll do, we'll let Mr. Walk and Mr. Brasini sit next to each other, and then we'll go at it some more. At this time, I'll recognize Mr. Johnson of Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate so much the panel being here today. Very important issues we're talking about, the health of an industry, jobs, our economy. Very important. Mr. Henry or Mr. McAvoy, can one of you talk more about the ability to get a loan for a control device to comply with the EPA's MAC? I mean, if you had to get one of these loans, how would it affect your employment level at your facility? Microphone. Turn.
It would greatly affect it because we probably couldn't obtain the loan. And even if we were able to structure it in such a way that we could make payments, the cyclical nature of our industry and so forth, would probably cause us to default at some point in time.
Okay. Mr. Henry?
The one thing that makes it really hard at this current juncture is that we've been through a very rough 8 years. I don't think anybody in the brick industry would say they've enjoyed the last 8 years. And so our balance sheets reflect that. And so to go and try to secure a loan now and look a banker in the face and go, well, here are my financials.
Sure.
I need $7, $8 million. There's not a bank out there that would look at ours and feel very good about being paid back.
Right. Well, there's this status of a synthetic miner. You're able to get underneath the caps, and that you would be then given some relief from some of this. But how would that affect? Let's say you were to be identified as a synthetic miner. How would that affect the company's ability to grow?
It's a very good question. And we have two plants that are side by side in Selma. And if we became a synthetic miner, we would no longer have the ability to grow in our local community. We would have to, if we grew, we would have to grow outside of that area.
So basically that limits your ability to create jobs and provide economic growth in your community. For both of you again, Mr. Henry and Mr. McAvoy, how would this particular legislation that we're talking about, the draft, the BRIC Act, be helpful? I mean, considering that the industry has already spent hundreds of millions to comply with a similar EPA rule in the past, only to have the courts vacate the rule a few years later, how would the BRIC Act be helpful?
Well, I would say first, we all want to do our part in the industry to be good to the environment. We want to do that. But there's only finite resources we have to spend on that. And what we don't want to have happen is have another rule vacated or the baseline changed, and we've spent a lot of money unnecessarily to comply with a rule that may not take effect or be changed down the road. And it's a lot of money to spend not knowing that it's necessary.
So letting the judicial reviews and letting the process play out before you have to comply would be certainly would be financially more acceptable to your industry, right?
Certainly, we'd know exactly what we had to do. We would have 3 years to comply with the final rule. you know, and make sure that we don't waste resources.
Okay. Mr. Henry, continuing with you, the study that you attached to your testimony states that foreign competition in the brick industry has not been a factor in the past. Is that correct?
Foreign competition as far as importing brick from other countries, no.
And can you explain why that's not a factor?
Brick weigh a lot. They cost a lot to ship.
Sure. I knew that, but I wanted the rest of the committee to understand that. How might this unique situation, that is the relative absence of foreign competition, coupled with the EPA's rules which threaten the very survival of many of the family-owned brick plants across America, how would this affect the future availability of U.S. brick? I mean, we don't have any coming in imported. You guys go out of business and can't produce brick. Are we back to building buildings with sticks and straw?
Or vinyl or something, yeah. The brick industry is very expensive to get into, not only because of the control devices, but just the process itself is, and so there would not be a lot of newcomers to our industry if I had to guess.
All right. Mr. McAvoy, my time has expired, but if we could go ahead.
My guess what would happen is the few multinational brick companies that have access to capital and so forth would be there and
to fill that void, yeah.
And the small.
So it'd be other countries that would benefit from
yeah, they wouldn't be made overseas, but they would be definitely, the profits would be going there.
All right. Another example of policies that enable our competitors overseas, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Mr. Walker a series of questions. The Sense Act would give coal refuse facilities special consideration under the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CSAPR. And EPA issued this rule to protect the health of millions of Americans by reducing air pollution and requiring states to reduce power plant emissions that cross state lines and contribute to air quality problems in other states. CSAPR ensures that downwind states don't have to impose more stringent controls on local businesses to make up for the effects of increased out-of-state pollution. And the rule achieves all of this by creating economic incentives to reduce pollution from power plants. So, Mr. Walk, if enacted, how would the Sense Act impact the operation of the CSAPR program? Would pollution reduction still be incentivized?
No, certainly not. Is
your mic on there? You want to press that?
It is.
Okay.
Can you not hear me okay? Is that better?
That's good.
Well, what the Sense Act does is it establishes these, static, permanent, higher pollution levels for sulfur dioxide available just to waste coal plants, and everyone else has to make the accommodating reductions, whether that's in your downwind state of New Jersey, Congressman Pallone, or within the state of Pennsylvania itself. There is available technology in the form of scrubbers to meet the lower sulfur dioxide limits in the cross-state rule and in the mercury and air toxics rule, and you have plants that are either operating that equipment today or installing it. And so this is it's just kind of a raw political transfer from one sector to another after that sector suffered losses in courts when its arguments on the merits were not successful.
Okay, now some of today's testimony characterizes the CSAPR provisions in the Sense Act as merely correcting errors in how EPA set up the CSAPR rule. But I wanted to ask you, are coal refuse facilities different than traditional coal facilities? Should EPA have treated them differently under the CSAPR rule?
Well, certainly they're different in the fuel they burn, but just as lignite and bituminous and anthracite and other types of facilities are. What Congress said in 1990 in a law that was actually voted on by Congressman Barton, what they said is that you're supposed to look at the best performers and the best performance. And EPA found that waste coal plants met that criteria with respect to the HCl emissions that we're talking about here today. I don't disagree with my colleague about mercury and PM, but that's a particular matter, but that's not what this bill is about. It's about HCl and sulfur dioxide relaxations under the cross-state rule and the mercury rule. There is available technology to meet those standards, and that's really not disputed in the rulemaking record or the judicial record, and I haven't seen any testimony today that actually overrides EPA's conclusion that scrubbers can meet 96% control reductions that will satisfy these standards, and that there are plants today that are meeting those standards, sometimes with lime injection being used as well. But the coal sector has been reducing these forms of pollution for 40 years in this country, and that is no different at a boiler that is using what we call waste coal.
All right, well, if a state wanted to treat coal refuse facilities differently, do they have that ability to do so under the EPA rule?
They absolutely do. That's been the hallmark of the interstate program since its inception in 1977, that they have the first crack, and in fact, the final crack if they want to take it. What's really instructive, after all this talk that we've been hearing about how burden it is to states that want to coal waste plants that should be incentivized, there is not a single state in the country covered by the cross-state rule that departed from the formula that EPA adopted for allocating allowances. Why is that? Because EPA used a formula that was based upon highly cost-effective reductions. And so the power generators in all of those states, including states with waste coal plants, didn't want that formula disrupted. Now, the waste coal plant operators did, but they did not prevail in Pennsylvania or West Virginia. Their state officials made different decisions. They could change that decision, and EPA would approve that change.
So, I mean, are the CASPR provisions in the Sense Act even necessary?
No, they're not necessary. And I read EPA Administrator McCabe's statement, and I believe she uses that exact word. They are unnecessary. If the state of Pennsylvania wants to reallocate allowances along the lines in the Sense Act and to take them away from in-state coal generators or take them away from manufacturers or whomever they choose, they may do so under today's law without any need for this legislation.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Beck, you state in your testimony that the EPA wants the small coal waste plants to reduce mercury emissions 70% of just 8 ounces. How does this compare to large coal plants? Turn your mic on and pull it real close there. The people listen on the internet and they can't hear unless you get your mic up close.
On the mercury, the 70% on the mercury, did you say?
Right. In your testimony, you said
Right.
EPA wants small coal waste plants to reduce the mercury emissions.
That was my understanding of the rule, that they were going to put a blanket over it and require all the coal-fired power plants to reduce mercury 70%.
So it's the same as the large coal?
Yes. Yeah.
There's no difference in the small coal plants?
I'm not sure what the amounts are or the concentrations are on the anthracite coal that they have out there. But I know about the waste bituminous coal and the regular bituminous coal plants.
Are you in a position where you could discuss the financial impact of this rule on small coal waste plants?
The problem is 70% of 8 ounces. The one waste coal plant did a stack emission test.
Can you pull your mic a little closer for
8
me?
ounces.
Can you pull your microphone closer to you?
And found 8 ounces per year coming out of the stack on an actual emissions test. And the larger normal coal plants, which burn the deep coal or the strip mine coal, the one was producing 1,600 pounds of mercury a year. So, 70% of 1,600 pounds that's a lot of emissions coming out. But how do you reduce 8 ounces by 70%? That's probably not detectable.
So what's the impact of this for the industry as a whole then?
They would have to spend a lot of money to try to get it down that low.
Or go out of business? Maybe.
And it'd probably put them out of business. And my issue with that is if the small waste coal burning plants go out of business, there are going to be more piles that ignite and throw many times more mercury into the atmosphere than the waste coal plants ever do.
Okay. And Mr. Bersini, excuse me, could you discuss the alternative compliance options in the Sense Act for coal refuse facilities burning high sulfur coal?
The alternative option is to identify a performance standard, 93% sulfur dioxide removal, and add that as an option to provide for a compliance demonstration. that would only be used by the bituminous coal refuse-fired plants. People keep talking as though we're talking about all of the coal refuse plants. The Sense Act really provides relief for bituminous coal refuse plants. Because of the fuel makeup, the anthracite, they can meet the current alternative SO2 standard. As far as the statement that was made that everybody meets HCl, that's not in fact true at all. In Pennsylvania, there's one coal refuse plant of either type, bituminous or anthracite, that meets the HCl. The circumstance is that that plant is a low emitter, and that one plant was used in the development of the MACT floor. But that's one plant, that's an outlier. It was the last plant built, came online in 2004. There's vast differences between coal and coal refuse plants. It's not only the fuel, it's the technology used to burn the fuel to make the material. Large coal-fired power plants are pulverized coal-fired power plants. They can be equipped with selective catalytic reduction for nitrogen oxides. They can be equipped with wet flue gas scrubbers in a cost-effective fashion. That's, by the way, how the large coal-fired plants will control mercury. They will not be doing it with any mercury-specific control technology. The mercury will be removed as a co-benefit of the sulfur dioxide control in the coal-fired power plants. But as far as another statement that the state gets a first crack, that's not the case in Casper. It's been a FIP from day one. And in fact, if you go back and you look at other Department of Environmental Protection letters from Pennsylvania DEP, there was great consternation raised over the FIP first, because the states were not given the opportunity in Casper to do anything. They were not. It was not similar to CARE, where a budget was established and the states had the opportunity to develop their own allocation methodologies, which is what we did in Pennsylvania. And other states did the same thing.
I'm a little confused on my time. I've gone from 8, the chairman was very generous, gave me 8 minutes and 20 seconds for a while, and it stopped, and then a minute, and now 38 seconds. So I'm not sure what.
You've actually been over 5 minutes, but we'll give you
Has it
30
really?
seconds.
Okay, well, with that, I'll yield back. I've been trying to watch the clock and fit in my questions, but that didn't work too well. So I think the regulators have taken a hold of our clocks.
The regulated, not the regulators, the regulated.
Okay, thank you. This time we'll recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panel for being here. Mr. Walkie, where are you from?
I'm from South Carolina.
South Carolina. What's your interest in Pennsylvania?
Well, my interest is in air pollution, and this bill concerns.
Do you believe in states' rights?
Plants that are.
But do you believe in states' rights?
Sure. There's a whole.
So what you're opposing is going to affect.
But
what you're opposing is going to affect the people that really live in Pennsylvania. And I have a big problem with people that are injecting their opinion in a community they don't live in. You don't understand how important it is, the way of life it is for those that live in Pennsylvania, but yet you want to inject your opinion in it. That's why we set up states' rights to begin with. And you said you believe in it, and you say there's a way that states can go around it, and they have the final say in it. You and I both know that's absolutely not true. Because what happens is EPA sets the standards, and then they hold the entire state hostage for it, and that's how we're putting an entire industry out of business. And then you say that there's scrubbers that's available. Well, how much do those scrubbers cost? How much do those scrubbers cost that you're talking about to install? What do they cost an individual or the industry to install per scrubber?
Congressman, there are different sizes according to.
Give me an average.
I don't think an average.
So you're saying that this technology is available, but you don't even know what it costs. And then again, you're not even going to pay it because you don't even live in the state. But yet you want to put your opinion in there. I have a big problem with this.
Congressman, I was invited to testify.
I understand you were invited.
I've only lived in 2 states for my life, but I'm testifying
that you were invited.
About a bill that applies across the country.
You can listen. I'm talking right now.
Yes.
So I understand that you were invited, and I get that, and I appreciate you being here. But you start acting like all this technology is available, and it's just as simple as installing it like it would be hooking up a garden hose. But you don't even know what it cost. And I don't even actually know if the technology is actually there. And Mr. Bersini, Is that right? Does the technology really exist that Mr. Walkie is talking about?
Well, this is very, very important. You can look at this and say, what is technically, if you had all the money you wanted and all the money you needed, and you had all the opportunity for design engineering, could you design a technology to take out the difference? Yeah, you probably could, but nobody would be in business anymore, especially in Pennsylvania, where we operate as competitive wholesale generators. We are not rate-based. We are competitive companies, no different than any other competitive company. We have to recover our costs from the PJM wholesale electric market. If you were to attempt to build a scrubber, and I do know what scrubbers cost because I've put them on coal-fired power plants and I've put them on big plants, and I know that they don't go on little plants because the plants I used to take care of in many cases are now retired because they can't afford to put it, and they're considerably larger than these plants. In the case of a large coal-fired facility that I used to take care of as the environmental air quality manager, it was a 1,700 megawatt facility. The scrubbers cost $675 million. You go to these small plants, and that was to remove, and if you look at the dollar per ton, you were starting with no control, essentially, of sulfur dioxide. Now, you look at these plants are actually controlled, and they're controlled to 93%. The scrubber gets to 98%. So you're looking at this little difference of 5%. So if you look on a dollar per ton basis, all of a sudden you stick a $100 million scrubber to get 5% more, when in fact you have allowances going to retired units, which are only going to sell them in the market so somebody can emit them. This is a net wash. All of this upwind, downwind discussion is not an accurate reflection. This is about preserving the budget established by EPA. It's about having a pragmatic solution that works. It's about making it so everybody can be okay. But somebody can't be okay because they want it everything the way they want. And there is a way to get to the right solution.
Right, and just to sum it up, this isn't as easy, Mr. Walkie, as just putting a muffler on a car. And that's how you make it sound. And I don't mean to come across, confrontational to you, but you're here to testify, but yet you don't have all your facts. I yield back.
Jim yields back, and that concludes the questions and concludes today's hearing on these two pieces of legislation. Once again, I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here and for giving us your perspective on both of these pieces of legislation. We'll keep the record open for 10 days, and we look forward to working with all of you as we make an effort to bring these bills to the floor. And do you have anything else, Jerry? Yeah. Okay. So that concludes the hearing. Thank you all once again.